Clara Whitfield was 44 years old the winter she buried her husband, lost her land, and stood in the mud outside the only home she had ever known with $19 sewn into the hem of her coat. It was Elias Bragg, president of the Millbrook Hollow Trust and Savings Bank, who signed the paper that took the farm from her, calling it nothing personal, only business. The note called due the same month her husband's lungs finally gave out from the fever he'd carried home from a hard winter tending cattle in the breaks. What she had left in the world fit into a single canvas grip, her mother's sewing shears, a Bible with a cracked spine, and those $19, folded small and tight as a secret. She spent 5 of them on a broken-down army supply wagon rotting behind Tanner's salvage yard, a relic so warped and sun-silvered that the yard boy laughed when she asked the price. Certain she was joking, certain no sane woman would want a wagon the army itself had written off as lost property decades before. Its cargo vanished somewhere in the tall grass country and never recovered. Everyone in town called it foolish. What none of them knew, what Clara herself did not yet know, was that sealed beneath its floorboards was something that had waited over 15 years to be found. Something that would not only save her, but would finally settle a debt the whole town had been paying without knowing it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Whitfield. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, tell us where you're from in the comments below, because this story is for you. Clara had not been born to hardship, though hardship had found her early enough that she no longer remembered a version of herself without it. She had come into the world in 1835 in a modest farmhouse outside Lexington, Missouri, the third of 5 children born to a wheelwright named Amos Doyle and his wife Ruth. A woman known throughout the county for her steady hands and her stubborn refusal to let waste sit unused. It was from her mother that Clara learned the quiet doctrine that would define her life, though she would not have called it a doctrine at the time, only common sense. Nothing broken was worthless until you had truly looked at it, and most people never looked. Ruth Doyle could take a torn quilt destined for the rag bin and coax 3 more years of use from it, could take a chipped plate and turn it into a planting dish. Could take a child who felt useless and hand her a task that made her indispensable. Clara grew up watching her mother's hands work this alchemy on hundreds of small, disregarded things, and she absorbed the lesson the way a child absorbs a language, without ever being formally taught it. By the time she was 12, she could mend harness leather better than most grown men, could patch a wagon wheel with scraps others would have thrown to the fire, and had developed, without anyone naming it for her, an instinct for reading the bones of a broken thing and knowing whether it still had life left inside it. Her father's trade put wagons and their workings into her hands from childhood, and she spent long afternoons in his shop watching him fit spokes and steam bend rims. Listening to him talk about the great supply trains that had once rolled through the county during the war, hauling everything a garrison needed across country that wanted to swallow both man and cargo whole. Amos Doyle had done contract repair work for the Quartermaster Corps during those years, and he spoke of army wagons with a kind of reverence, telling Clara that a well-built supply wagon was one of the most honest machines ever made, built to carry the truth of what an army needed to survive, nothing hidden, nothing wasted. She did not know then how strange those words would come to feel later in her life. She married Thomas Whitfield in 1856, a quiet, steady man with sun-browned forearms and a laugh that came rarely but meant everything when it did. And together they moved further west to build a homestead of their own outside a young settlement called Millbrook Hollow. Drawn by the promise of good bottomland along a slow green river and the low price of unclaimed acreage. Thomas was a farmer by trade but a dreamer by temperament, forever sketching plans for barns he intended to build and orchards he intended to plant. And Clara loved him for the way he could look at raw, unbroken prairie and see an entire life already growing there. They built a soddy first, then a proper frame house, then a barn, raising 2 children in the years between, a boy named Peter and a girl named Sarah, both of whom would grow and eventually move east to St. Louis in search of steadier work, writing letters home that grew further apart as the years passed, the way letters do. Clara did not resent this drift, she had raised her children to seek out life wherever it called them. Just as her mother had taught her to see possibility instead of scarcity in the years the crops came in thin. The Whitfields were never wealthy, but they were, for a long while, secure, their debts modest and their neighbors kind. Their names spoken with respect at the general store and the little clapboard church that anchored the town's one real street. Clara became known in Millbrook Hollow much the way her mother had been known in Lexington, the woman you brought a torn coat to before you brought it to the rag heap. The woman who could look at a lame mule or a cracked churn or a grieving widow and see, patiently, what could still be saved. It was a quiet reputation, the kind that does not make a woman rich but makes her trusted, and trust, Clara had always believed, was worth more than most currencies in a town small enough that everyone's fortunes were tangled together like roots beneath the same soil. It was in the autumn of 1862 that Millbrook Hollow first felt the true weight of the war being fought far to the east and south. When word came that a supply train bound for a Kansas garrison had been ambushed somewhere in the tall grass corridors not 2 days' ride from town, the wagons burned, the guard detail scattered. The cargo never recovered. The story became local legend almost overnight. Told and retold at the general store with the particular relish small towns reserve for tragedies that happen just far enough away to feel thrilling rather than sorrowful. Some said raiders had taken the payroll gold meant for 3 companies of soldiers. Others said it had carried medicine desperately needed at a field hospital, medicine that never arrived, with consequences no one liked to speak of too plainly. The one detail everyone agreed upon was that the wagon master leading that train, a Colonel Josiah Bragg, had survived the supposed ambush nearly unscathed. Had ridden into the nearest fort 3 days late and half-starved with a story of raiders and fire, and had never been seriously questioned about it, being, as he was, a man already well regarded. Already wealthy, already the sort of man whose word was simply believed. Clara remembered her father shaking his head over that story more than once, remarking that something in the account never sat right with him, though he could never say precisely what. That was the world Clara Whitfield had built her life inside of, a life of steady work and modest comfort, when the fever came for Thomas in the winter of 1878. Working through him slowly across 4 brutal months until his lungs simply could not carry him any further, and Clara found herself, for the first time since girlhood, entirely alone. The fall came quickly once it began, the way a fence post rots quietly for years before it finally gives way in a single afternoon. Thomas had taken a loan against the farm 2 winters before his death, a modest sum meant to see them through a season of failed wheat. Borrowed from the newly established Millbrook Hollow Trust and Savings Bank under the management of a relatively young, ambitious man named Elias Bragg. Grandson of the same Colonel Josiah Bragg whose name still carried a certain untouchable prestige throughout the county. A name people spoke with automatic respect the way one speaks of weather or scripture, without examining it too closely. Elias had built the bank into the most powerful institution in 3 counties within a decade, financing the railroad spur that finally connected Millbrook Hollow to the wider world. Funding the new brick storefronts that had begun replacing the town's older wooden buildings, and quietly acquiring, through foreclosure after careful foreclosure, a remarkable portion of the farmland surrounding the town. He was polite in the particular way of men who have never had to be anything else, always addressing Clara as Mrs. Whitfield with a small courteous nod. Always speaking of unfortunate circumstances and difficult decisions as though he were merely a weather system passing through her life rather than the one steering the storm. Thomas's illness had drained what little savings they held in reserve, medicine and doctor's visits eating through money faster than any drought ever had, and by the time he passed, the loan sat unpaid and the note had come due. Clara pleaded for time, offered to work the land herself through the coming season, offered to sell what livestock remained to pay down the principal, but Elias Bragg explained, with the same unbothered courtesy, that the bank's obligations to its own creditors did not allow for such patience, that business simply could not run on sentiment. However much he personally sympathized with her situation, she would later learn, though not for some time yet, that the parcel of land under her farm sat directly along a proposed extension of the rail spur. Land Elias Bragg had every reason to want back under the bank's control before that extension was formally announced. But in that raw winter of foreclosure, Clara knew none of this. She knew only that the papers were signed, that the sheriff's notice was nailed to her own front door, and that she had 30 days to remove herself from the only home she had built with her own hands and her husband's. She spent those 30 days doing what she had always done, looking clearly at what remained rather than mourning what was gone. She sold the furniture piece by piece to neighbors who could not quite meet her eyes as they counted out coins for her kitchen table, her rocking chair, the quilt frame her mother had given her as a wedding gift. She sold the last of the chickens and the milk cow, kept only her mother's shears, the family Bible, and the clothes she could carry, and when the accounting was finished, when every debt owed to every soul in Millbrook Hollow had been paid down to the last cent because Clara Whitfield would not leave owing anyone anything, she found she had $19 to her name and nowhere in particular to be. She took a room above the mercantile for a few nights, paid for with $2 of those dollars, and told herself she would decide her next move once the shock of it had worn thin enough to think clearly through. It was on the third of those nights, walking the frozen lane behind the shop simply to keep from sitting still with her own thoughts, that she passed Tanner's salvage yard and saw, half buried in old snow and rust, the shape of an army supply wagon that time and neglect had nearly erased. Ansel Tanner ran the salvage yard the way his father had before him, buying up broken machinery, dead livestock equipment, and abandoned wagons for whatever pittance kept the operation solvent, stripping what could be resold and letting the rest slowly return to the earth behind his fence line. The wagon Clara found had sat there, by Ansel's own admission, for at least 15 years. Hauled in by a farmer who'd found it abandoned along a dry creek bed out past the old fort road and dragged it in hoping for salvage money, only to discover the wood too warped and the ironwork too rusted to be worth the trouble of stripping. It had simply sat since, gathering seasons, until it had become less a wagon than a fixture, the kind of object a town stops truly seeing. When Clara asked the price, Ansel squinted at her as though checking whether she was serious, then shrugged and said $5 would cover it and be glad to have the space back. His son laughed outright at the sight of a newly widowed, newly landless woman spending precious money on what was, by any sane measure, a pile of rotten lumber and rust-frozen iron. Clara said nothing to defend the purchase, because she did not entirely understand it herself yet, only that something in the wagon's bones, the particular honest solidity of its build, the quartermaster's marking still faintly visible beneath the grime, had called to something old and instinctive in her, the same instinct her mother had planted in her decades before. She paid the $5, arranged with Ansel to leave it in his yard a few days longer while she found a place to keep it, and walked away $14 poorer and, though she could not have said why, strangely less afraid than she had been in weeks. She found the first clue 3 days later, after arranging to have the wagon hauled to a small rented shed at the edge of town. A space she'd secured with 2 more of her remaining dollars and the promise of mending the shed owner's harness in exchange for reduced rent. She had begun the slow work of assessing what, if anything, of the wagon could be saved or sold, running her hands along boards she had learned as a girl to read like a second language. When her palm caught on an inconsistency in the wagon bed's floor, a seam too straight, too deliberate to be simple where an ordinary supply wagon floor was built of long single planks running the bed's full length, this one had a shorter section near the rear, joined with a precision that spoke of intention rather than repair. She worked at it with her mother's shears and the edge of a chisel borrowed from the shed owner, and after the better part of an hour spent coaxing rusted nails free without splitting the old wood, the section lifted away to reveal a shallow hidden compartment built into the wagon's very frame, the kind of space no ordinary quartermaster wagon would have carried. The kind of space built by someone who had planned, from the very start, to hide something. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and dark with age, Clara found a leather dispatch case bearing the faded stamp of the Quartermaster Corps, and within it, astonishingly intact, a set of papers that would take her the rest of that long night to fully understand. The papers were, at first glance, unremarkable, a set of supply manifests and requisition forms of the sort any army wagon might carry, dense with figures and signatures Clara did not recognize. But tucked among them was a letter, unsigned, written in a hand that trembled slightly with either age or fear, addressed to no one in particular. As though the writer had intended it more as confession than correspondence. The letter described, in careful and haunted detail, the events of that autumn ambush in 1862, the one Clara's own father had spoken of decades before with quiet suspicion. According to the letter's author, who identified himself only as a junior teamster assigned to the train, there had been no ambush at all, or rather, the ambush had been staged. Orchestrated by the very man meant to protect the cargo, Colonel Josiah Bragg himself, who had led the train off its charted route under cover of darkness. Directed his most trusted men to bury and conceal 2 wagons worth of cargo, and then set fire to a third empty wagon to create the illusion of a raid before riding the surviving distance to the fort with a story already rehearsed. The teamster had been sworn to silence under threat of court-martial and worse, had carried the secret for years out of fear, but had, in what appeared to be his final act connected to the affair, hidden the true manifest and his confession inside this very wagon's secret compartment before the train's remaining vehicles were dispersed and eventually written off as lost or destroyed army property. Sold off in pieces to salvage men who had no idea what they were truly hauling away. The manifest itself detailed the missing cargo with devastating specificity, not merely payroll gold for 3 companies of soldiers, though that had certainly been part of it, but a substantial sum designated by Army order for distribution to the war widows and orphans of the surrounding county. A relief fund established after a brutal engagement had left an unusual number of local families without husbands or fathers. Money meant to be delivered to a designated agent in Millbrook Hollow for distribution among grieving households, money that had simply never arrived, its absence explained away by a fictional raid. Its true fate known only to a colonel who had gone on, in the years following, to become one of the wealthiest and most respected men in the region, and whose grandson now sat behind a mahogany desk in the very town that fund had been meant to save. Clara sat with those papers until the candle burned down to a stub, reading the confession again and again by the failing light, feeling something shift inside her chest that was neither anger nor triumph but something closer to grief. Grief for a teamster long dead who had carried a secret he was too frightened to properly confess, grief for widows and orphans decades gone who had waited for help that never came, and grief, too, for herself, standing now in nearly the same position those long-forgotten families had once stood in, cast off by circumstance while a Bragg sat comfortably above it all. But beneath the grief, quiet and steady as her mother's hands over a torn quilt, she felt something else beginning to take shape, the recognition that she was, perhaps, the only person left in Millbrook Hollow who could set this particular old wrong right. The manifest included a rough sketch, clearly drawn from memory rather than precision, marking the approximate location where the 2 concealed wagons of cargo had been buried. Somewhere along the dry creek bed near the old Fort Road, the very stretch of country where, 15 years later, a farmer had found this abandoned wagon and dragged it in for scrap. Clara understood immediately that finding the buried cargo, if it still existed at all after so many years, would require more than a $5 purchase and a quiet evening's discovery. It would require going to someone, and the only people with any authority to act on such a find were precisely the sort of men least likely to believe a newly widowed, newly landless woman with a story about a hidden confession found in a rusted wagon nobody else had wanted. She began, cautiously, by seeking out Reverend Elias Cobb, no relation to the banker despite the shared first name. An old man who had served Millbrook Hollow's small congregation for over 30 years and who Clara trusted to hear her out without immediately dismissing her. The Reverend read the confession twice, his weathered face growing paler with each pass, and confirmed what Clara had begun to suspect, he remembered, from his own earliest years in the ministry. Families in the congregation who had quietly struggled and eventually left the county in the years following that supposed ambush, families who had been promised relief that never materialized. Families whose absence from the historical memory of Millbrook Hollow was itself a kind of quiet erasure. Together, Clara and the Reverend approached the county land office to inquire about the old Fort Road creek bed, learning that the land, unclaimed and largely untouched, remained under territorial rather than private ownership, meaning that whatever lay buried there, if it could be found, belonged by law to no single family but to the public trust. Precisely the sort of arrangement that made restoration, rather than personal enrichment, not just possible but proper. Word of Clara's discovery could not stay contained for long in a town the size of Millbrook Hollow, and it reached Elias Bragg within the week, carried, as these things often are, by someone who had meant no harm by the telling. Elias arrived at the rented shed on a gray afternoon with two of his bank's clerks in tow, his courteous manner intact but noticeably thinner. Stretched taut over something Clara recognized immediately as fear dressed up as concern. He explained, in the same measured tone he'd used to foreclose on her farm, that old rumors about his grandfather had circulated for years. That grief and suspicion often invented stories where none belonged, and that it would be a shame, a genuine shame, for a grieving widow to embarrass herself chasing fantasies built on rotten wood and an anonymous letter that proved nothing at all. He offered, with what he clearly believed was generosity, to purchase the wagon and its contents from her outright for $50, more money than she had seen in months. Framing it as an act of kindness toward a woman down on her luck rather than what it plainly was, an attempt to bury, a second time, what his grandfather had buried once already. Clara declined. It was, she would later say, one of the few times in her life she had felt entirely certain of anything, and she told Elias Bragg, in a voice as calm and steady as her mother's had ever been over a torn quilt, that the money in question had never belonged to a Bragg to sell or to buy back. That it belonged to the widows and orphans of a war long over and to the town that had quietly absorbed their loss without ever knowing its true cause. Elias's courtesy finally cracked at the edges, and he warned her, with less patience now, that a woman in her position, with no land, no standing, and no husband to speak for her, would find it difficult to convince anyone in the county that a 15-year-old rumor deserved to unravel the reputation of the most respected family in 3 counties. He reminded her, pointedly, that the bank still held considerable influence over who received credit, who secured employment, and whose word carried weight in matters of local dispute. A threat delivered so smoothly it might have passed, to an untrained ear, as simple observation rather than warning. But Clara had spent her entire life learning to see the true worth of things others had written off, and she recognized, in that moment, that Elias Bragg's confidence was itself a kind of tell. The reaction of a man who understood exactly how much he stood to lose. She gathered the confession, the manifest, and the Reverend's corroborating testimony about the vanished families. And together they brought the matter before the Territorial Land Commissioner in the county seat, a decision that placed the discovery beyond the reach of any single bank's local influence. And set in motion, at last, a proper search of the old Fort Road Creek bed under official supervision. The search took the better part of 2 weeks, conducted by a small crew of laborers under the Land Commissioner's authority with Clara present at her own insistence. Walking the dry creek bed each day with the manifest's rough sketch in hand, matching remembered landmarks to the changed contours of 15 years' worth of weather and erosion. They found the first buried wagon on the 9th day, its wooden frame long collapsed but its iron-strapped strongboxes remarkably intact beneath the packed earth, and within those boxes, payroll currency long since obsolete in form but redeemable at face value through territorial treasury channels, along with a second, smaller cash explicitly marked in ledger hand matching the confession's own handwriting, for distribution to the War Relief Fund of Millbrook Hollow and its surrounding households. The reckoning that followed was neither loud nor swift, but it was thorough. The Territorial Commissioner's office, once presented with the confession, the manifest, and the recovered strongboxes bearing markings that matched Army records still held in Regional Archive, opened a formal inquiry into the conduct of the long-deceased Colonel Josiah Bragg, an inquiry that, while it could not punish a man 3 decades dead, formally and publicly established the truth of what he had done, stripping the Bragg name of the untouchable prestige it had traded on for 2 generations. Elias Bragg found himself, almost overnight, no longer the unquestioned pillar of Millbrook Hollow but a man whose family fortune had been quietly built, in significant part, On money stolen from grieving widows and orphans, a truth that spread through the town with the particular speed reserved for the fall of the powerful. Depositors began withdrawing their trust along with their funds, the bank standing eroding not through any single dramatic confrontation but through the slow, cumulative weight of a community recalculating who deserved its faith, and within the year Elias Bragg quietly sold his controlling interest in the bank and relocated east. His name in Millbrook Hollow forever after spoken not with automatic respect but with the particular, careful quiet reserved for stories people are still deciding how to tell. The Recovered Relief Fund, once properly accounted and adjusted through the territorial treasury for its long delay, proved substantial enough not only to be distributed among the identifiable descendants of the families it had originally been intended for, tracked down through church and county records with the Reverend's patient help, but also to fund the rebuilding of Millbrook Hollow's aging schoolhouse and the establishment of a small relief trust for future hardship. Administered not by any bank but by a community board on which Clara Whitfield, at the town's near-unanimous insistence, was asked to serve. She accepted a modest portion of the recovered funds herself, enough to purchase back a small parcel of her old homestead land and build a simple house upon it. But she directed the greater share toward the trust, telling the Reverend, in words that would eventually become something of a local saying, that she had not gone looking for money in that wagon, only for the truth, and the money had simply been the truth's way of finally arriving where it always should have gone. Clara Whitfield had been 44 years old, and the winter she lost everything had seemed, at the time, like the end of a long and reasonably good life rather than the beginning of anything new. She had been cast out by the same courteous cruelty that had built the Bragg fortune for 2 generations, left with $19 and a canvas grip. And she had spent 5 of those precious dollars on a rotting army supply wagon that an entire town had looked at for 15 years without truly seeing. What she had understood, standing in Tanner's salvage yard while the yard boy laughed at her foolishness, was something her mother had taught her decades before without ever quite naming it. That value does not announce itself, that the world is full of broken, discarded things carrying secrets no one has bothered to look closely enough to find. And that sometimes the only difference between a pile of rotten lumber and the restoration of an entire community's stolen history is one person willing to run her hands slowly and patiently along the seams other people had stopped seeing altogether. She had not set out to expose Elias Bragg, had not set out to become the town's quiet arbiter of relief funds and hardship trusts, had wanted, if she was honest, only to survive one more difficult winter with whatever dignity she could carry forward. But dignity, it turned out, was precisely the thing that had let her see what everyone else had walked past for 15 years, and it was dignity, finally, that let her use what she found not to enrich herself but to give back to a town, and to families long scattered. Something that had been owed to them since before she herself had ever set foot in Millbrook Hollow. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Clara. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you would share it with someone who might need reminding tonight that overlooked things, and overlooked people, are so rarely as worthless as the world first assumes. We'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something, or someone, that others had already written off? Tell us in the comments below, we read every one. Until next time, stay close.